We start tonight in Russia, where reports suggest Ukraine could be stepping up its cross-border attacks against strategic targets. The strikes seem to have caused major unease in the Kremlin, leading Vladimir Putin to gather his Security Council today to discuss domestic security. In the latest incident, the governor of Russia's Kursk region says a drone attacked an airfield, setting an oil storage tank on fire. Kursk lies on the border with Ukraine, but the attack comes a day after multiple explosions at military bases in the Ryazan region and at the Engels air base, much deeper inside Russian territory. Moscow blamed Ukrainian drones for those blasts, calling them acts of terrorism. Kyiv has not claimed responsibility. Now let's unpack all of this and bring in Frank Ledwidge. He's a lawyer and military analyst. He's also a former officer with the British Army. He has served in the Balkans, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Mr. Ledwidge, welcome back to the day. Ukraine hasn't claimed responsibility, but things as they stand, how big of a blow are these attacks to Moscow?
Well, Nicole, this is a colossal military failure. It's not as if these airports or these air bases were minor installations. They were two of the major air bases of the Russian Air and Space Force, particularly Engels, where most of its so-called strategic bomber force is based. And what that says to the Russian people is, if you can't defend those from external Ukrainian attack, what can you defend?
So how worried is the Kremlin about this?
Well, the message has always, or has since February, been percolating through the Russian people. It can't fail to do so. I mean, their own military commentators are full of comments about the failures of Russian forces in Ukraine. So the idea already that Russian forces aren't quite what they were cooked up to be before the war is already percolating through. But that's always been across the border, hasn't it? It hasn't yet crossed over into Russia in any significant way. Yes, there were some explosions, there were some accidents earlier in the war, Belgorod particularly. But this is a significant base. And if the Russian Air Force can't defend that, it's going to have problems defending other installations. And that message is spreading. How competent are our armed forces? Are we doing the right thing?
It seems like this came as a surprise, right? That it caught Russia off guard. How can something like that happen?
Well, it was audacious. The Ukrainians have demonstrated, I think, to the rest of the world that they are an audacious and swashbuckling armed forces. It can happen because they have been preparing over the last 10 months or so to conduct these strikes. They've been rejigging their forces and re-engineering their weaponry. And now we're beginning to see the results of that.
What kind of drone would enable Ukraine to strike so deeply into Russian territory? The defense ministry in Moscow says yesterday's strikes, at least, were carried out by Soviet-made drones.
That's probably right. We don't really know what did it, but the best guess is that it's a Tupolev 141 drone. Now, these are this makes it worse, really. They're 1970s technology. The Ukrainians have re-engineered the electronics and targeting systems. But essentially, this is an old-fashioned cruise missile that the Ukrainians have re-engineered, as far as we know. Now, it's probable as well that special forces were involved in guiding these into their targets. And that in itself, of course, is another worry for the Russians. How could this have been allowed to happen? But we know that Ukrainians are developing cruise missile capabilities, and that's essentially what these are.
This has exposed significant vulnerabilities in Russia's abilities to defend itself. But how can these kinds of attacks impact Russia's capabilities of striking Ukraine? Because these are strategic targets.
Right. It's the strategic nature, Nicole, that's important here. The message it gives to the wider population. The actual damage done to aircraft was quite limited. There were 2 or 3, yes, expensive, yes, up-to-date aircraft damaged. I don't think any were destroyed. But they're not going to stop the attacks in themselves. Now, the damage is not tactical, which is weaponry and weapons, but it's that political level that the messages were sent out. And that's why this was a strategic strike.
The war is increasingly unpopular among the Russian public, too, right? You talked about the pundits who are increasingly critical. The fact that attacks are now happening closer to home, do you think that'll lead to more anti-war sentiment, or could it have the opposite effect?
It depends really how the Ukrainians want to go on with this. I don't think, frankly, that they've got the capability to conduct the same kind of strikes that the Russians have been conducting against Ukraine on critical civilian infrastructure. But the point is not what they have, but what they might have, and what Russian people will start to fear. And they may start to fear that the Ukrainians might have the capability of dishing out the same kind of treatment that they've been dishing out to the Ukrainians quite liberally over the last 4 months and immiserating the population. And it's that fear that counts. It's that fear that becomes political. And it's that fear that Putin himself will be afraid of.
Where do you see this going? Do you think we'll see this kind of attack more frequently now? Was this a symbolic gesture, to call it in a way, to show Russia, you know, we can harm you? Is this going to be part of the daily warfare now?
No, I don't think so, Nicole, and I'll tell you why. I think the Americans would rein the Ukrainians back on that. This was a demonstration of capability of what we can do if we want to, I think. And nobody knows. But I would suspect, particularly given remarks today by Secretary Blinken and some reports that came out in America about the restrictions the Americans are placing on weaponry that's going to Ukraine, I think the Americans will be having a talk now with the Ukrainians. Let's not push this. You've shown what you can do. Let's rein back. But of course, as Blinken said today, it's up to the Ukrainians what they do. And the Americans have, I won't say limited influence, but their influence will go only so far.
But they wouldn't want to jeopardize international support, would they? Military analyst Frank Ledwidge,
Exactly.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Nicole.
And our correspondent Max Sanda joins us now from the Ukrainian capital. Max, 3 strikes in Russia in a matter of 24 hours. Are the dynamics of the war shifting?
Well, Nicole, it's a bit too early to tell at this moment, but let me tell you that this is not the first time that Ukraine has targeted or has gone after targets in Russia, in Russian territory, behind the border, essentially. Ever since the beginning of the war, Ukraine has flown drone attacks in the border regions or sent sea drones out into the Black Sea to attack Russian targets. Also on the Russian annexed Crimean Peninsula. But what is new about this attack is sheer the reach that the Ukrainians have demonstrated that they can have. The 2 air bases that were attacked were 500 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. And are targets of strategic importance. That's where long-range bombers take off to attack cities in Ukraine. Bombers that can be equipped with nuclear capabilities, and showing that Ukrainians that potentially they haven't claimed responsibility yet, but they can get to them and target these targets. That's surely worrisome for the Russians.
Yesterday, Moscow launched what Ukraine called massive missile attacks across the country. Ukraine's foreign minister now asked Western partners for more help in fending off aerial attacks. Let's have a listen and get right back to you.
I call on all partners to enhance military support for Ukraine. Today, it is especially critical to help Ukraine defend itself against Russian missile attacks. There is no need to look for excuses and postpone key decisions. It is time to close the sky over Ukraine. Do it with the help of air defense systems, which should arrive in Ukraine in sufficient quantities.
Max Kuleba says there is no time to lose and Ukraine needs help now. Is he going to get what he's asking for?
Yeah, Ukrainian cities across the country have been suffering from attacks on civilian infrastructure. Since the beginning of fall, Russians have increased the attacks and the magnitude of attacks. That is clear. Now, Ukraine relies on mostly on Soviet-era air defense systems, such as the S-300 system and the Buk system. But they have been provided by modern Western weapons by NATO countries, such as the US and Germany. For example, the NASAM system or the IRIS-T system. Just to give you an understanding, in yesterday's attacks, according to the Ukrainian Air Force, 100% of missiles that were intercepted by these modern systems. So naturally, the Ukrainians want more of those. They've been asking for the Patriot defense system, an American defense system that has a longer range, that is very very effective, but so far countries like Germany have been very hesitant in handing over such a powerful weapon, also in fear of depleting their own stocks. But according to Minister Kuleba, Ukraine is in contact with the U.S. in talks about providing this specific system as well as Abrams tanks, but these talks are going quite slowly, according to him.
And what about Russia? How have the events of the past 2 days affected the Kremlin's military confidence?
Right, so the Kremlin is certainly at the moment trying to find out what actually hit them, quite literally so. This morning, President Vladimir Putin held an emergency meeting in Moscow to discuss national domestic security issues. That was the official wording. They were certainly surprised by this attack and surprised to find out that they have such huge gaps in their air defense, and they will likely try to close them and find out the reasons for this, perhaps even shifting air defense capabilities from Russian-occupied territories in Ukraine back to Russia.
Max Sanda in Kyiv, thank you so much. And meanwhile, Russian forces are continuing their shelling of the city of Kherson in southern Ukraine. It was liberated only a month ago, to the joy of many residents who'd endured 8 months under occupation. But Russia's targeting of infrastructure and residential buildings is forcing many to seek safety elsewhere.
Time to get out of the city. Antonina and her children do not feel safe in Kherson.
You can hear the bombing. We live on the 9th floor. We have to sleep in the corridor or in the bathroom. We wake up 3 times a night. I'm losing my nerves.
Many others fleeing are at the main train station. The authorities are running special trains to get people to safety. This one's heading to Kyiv. After 8 months of brutal Russian occupation, Ukrainian forces finally recaptured Kherson last month. But the Russian military is still on the other side of the Dnipro River, and residents face relentless shelling. In the garage, excitement is buzzing. It's the first time Antonina's children are taking a train. They can't wait to leave the war behind.
I hope we'll get back soon, but I really don't know. Maybe it'll take 6 months. I don't know.
The train pulls into Kyiv. It's the last stop for many passengers, but their ordeal is far from over.